Welcome to Luxury Empire Stories.
Panic is a scent you cannot mask, not even with a $3,000 Tom Ford suit. Daria Caldwell sat at the head of his glass boardroom table, his Silicon Valley tech empire bleeding out by the minute. His only lifeline was the ruthless, anonymous venture capitalist who had just bought up his staggering corporate debt. Adjusting his silk tie, Daria practiced his most charming, manipulative smile for the billionaire savior he was about to meet. Heavy mahogany doors finally swung open. Footsteps echoed sharply against the marble. But it wasn't an aging Wall Street titan who walked in to save him. It was the brilliant woman he had betrayed, bankrupted, and thrown into the street exactly 5 years ago. To the outside world, Sophia and Daria Caldwell were the picture of modern success. Daria was the charismatic, silver-tongued CEO of Omnitech, a data-syncing software company that had just reached a valuation of $200 million. Sophia was his beautiful, supportive wife who hosted the charity galas, charmed the board members over expensive dinners, and kept their sprawling Manhattan penthouse looking like a spread in Architectural Digest. But the reality of Omnitech's foundation was a secret kept strictly behind closed doors. 7 years prior, they had been broke graduates living in a moldy apartment in Brooklyn. Daria had the vision and the sales pitch, but he lacked the technical execution. It was Sophia, an MIT-educated software engineer who had quietly sacrificed her own career trajectory, who stayed up until 4 a.m. every night writing the foundational algorithm for Omnitech's flagship product. She poured her genius into lines of code, debugging and refining while Daria slept. When they finally launched, Daria took the stage. Sophia stood in the shadows, clapping, content to let the man she loved bask in the spotlight. She believed they were a team. What was his was hers. The unraveling began on a brisk Tuesday in November. Sophia had decided to surprise Daria at the Omnitech headquarters with a rare vintage of scotch to celebrate their latest funding round. As she walked past the glass-walled offices, her husband's executive assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, looked up with wide, terrified eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell, Daria is in a meeting," Sarah stammered, physically moving to block the hallway. Sophia smiled warmly, ignoring the red flags. "It's fine, Sarah, I just need a minute." She bypassed the assistant and pushed open the heavy oak door to Daria's private suite. The scotch bottle slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The amber liquid pooled around her Italian leather boots, but Sophia didn't look down. Her eyes were locked on the leather sofa against the far wall. Daria was there, his shirt entirely unbuttoned. Straddling him was Vanessa Montgomery, the 26-year-old daughter of Omnitech's primary angel investor. Vanessa's hands were tangled in Daria's hair, and they were laughing, a rich, careless sound that stopped dead the moment the glass shattered. For a second, the room was suspended in a vacuum of silence. Sophia couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. Daria didn't panic. He didn't scramble to cover himself or beg for forgiveness. Instead, he calmly pushed Vanessa off his lap, buttoned his shirt with steady, deliberate movements, and looked at his wife with an expression of mild annoyance. "You should have knocked, Sophia," he said, his voice terrifyingly flat. Vanessa smirked, picking up her silk blouse from the floor. "I'll let you two chat. See you at dinner, Artie." She brushed past Sophia, the scent of her cloying, expensive perfume lingering in the air. "Daria," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling, the shock finally giving way to a sickening wave of betrayal. How could you?" Daria walked over to his desk, pouring himself a glass of water. "Let's not do the hysterics. You knew this marriage was a partnership of convenience for the last 2 years. Vanessa brings connections. Her father is Richard Montgomery. Do you know what that means for this company?" "This company?" Sophia's voice cracked, rising in volume. "The company built on my code, the company that wouldn't exist if I hadn't spent 3 years staring at a screen while you played golf with investors?" Daria laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut Sophia to the bone. "Your code? Sophia, you wrote a few scripts a decade ago. Omnitech is a machine. I am the face, the brain, the engine. You're a housewife who throws decent dinner parties. If you want to walk away, walk. But don't you dare stand there and pretend you built my empire." The absolute erasure of her sacrifice, the casual cruelty in his eyes, broke something fundamental inside Sophia. She turned and walked out, leaving the shattered glass behind her. But as the elevator descended to the lobby, the crushing sorrow began to harden. A cold, dangerous clarity took its place. The divorce was a bloodbath, orchestrated by Daria's bulldog of a lawyer, Simon Davies. Sophia had walked into the legal proceedings naive, believing that the truth of her contributions to Omnitech would matter. She assumed the courts would see her unpaid labor, her intellectual property, and grant her half of the company. She was disastrously wrong. Daria had spent years meticulously insulating himself. Long before Vanessa Montgomery entered the picture, Daria had quietly restructured the company's intellectual property rights, transferring the ownership of the original algorithms to a subsidiary shell corporation under his sole name. Sophia had signed the documents years ago. Hidden in a stack of routine tax papers, Daria had rushed her to sign while they were packing for a vacation. Sitting in the sterile gray conference room of Simon Davies's law firm, Sophia stared in horror at her own signature on the transfer deeds. "As you can see, Mrs. Caldwell," Simon said, his tone dripping with condescension, leaning back in his leather chair, "you have no legal claim to Omnitech. Furthermore, given the prenuptial agreement you signed, which, I might add, clearly states you waive rights to assets acquired post-marriage under his name, you are entitled to a lump sum of $50,000. And of course, you may keep the Audi." $50,000? Sophia's lawyer, a relatively inexpensive public practitioner she had scrambled to hire, looked pale. "My client practically built the software that—" "Your client," Daria interrupted, not looking up from his phone, "was unemployed for 7 years while I paid for her designer clothes and luxury vacations. She's lucky I'm not suing her for alimony." He finally looked at Sophia, his eyes empty. "Take the deal, Sophia. If you fight this, I will drag it out in court for a decade. I will bankrupt you in legal fees before we even see a judge. You have nothing. Be smart for once." Cornered, exhausted, and emotionally shattered, Sophia signed the papers. She handed over the keys to the penthouse and walked out into the freezing New York rain with a single suitcase and a check that wouldn't even cover a year's rent in the city. The next 6 months were a descent into a bleak, grueling reality. Sophia rented a tiny, run-down studio apartment in Queens. The radiator clanked all night, and the smell of stale cigarette smoke clung to the walls. She sold her jewelry, her designer bags, and eventually the Audi, just to keep herself afloat while she spiraled into a deep, paralyzing depression. She spent days staring at the water-stained ceiling, haunted by the images of Daria and Vanessa. They had married within 3 months of the divorce finalizing. Vogue had covered the wedding. The pictures were everywhere. Daria looking triumphant, Vanessa draped in diamonds that Sophia's genius had paid for. But rock bottom is a solid foundation to build upon. One bleak January evening, shivering under a thin blanket, Sophia opened a dusty cardboard box she had shoved in the back of her closet. Inside was her old laptop from her MIT days. She plugged it in, listening to the fan whir to life. She opened her old files, the original directories of the Omnitech code. She began to read through it, her fingers tracing the keys. As she looked at the architecture, the brilliant, intricate logic she had designed in her early 20s, a spark ignited in the dark void of her chest. She wasn't just a housewife, she was a savant. And she saw something else, too. She saw the limitations of her old code. She knew exactly where it would bottleneck as Omnitech tried to scale. She knew the fatal flaws Daria couldn't see because he didn't understand the machinery beneath his feet. The next morning, Sophia dressed in her only remaining tailored suit. She took the subway to Manhattan and waited in the lobby of a high-end financial firm for 4 hours. She was there to see Victor Cross. Victor was a legendary venture capitalist, a ruthless, brilliant man who had guest lectured at MIT during Sophia's senior year. He had been the only one to see her potential back then, offering her a junior partnership that she had foolishly declined to help Daria build his dream. When Victor finally emerged from the elevators surrounded by an entourage of junior analysts, Sophia stepped directly into his path. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice steady, despite the wild pounding of her heart. Victor stopped, his sharp, hawkish eyes narrowing as he took her in. "Sophia Bennett," he said, using her maiden name. He had a memory like a steel trap. "I heard about the divorce. A messy business. What are you doing here?" "I'm here to make you $1 billion, Sophia said without a flinch. Victor raised an eyebrow, waving his entourage away. "Bold, you have exactly 3 minutes. Walk with me." In a nearby coffee shop, Sophia didn't pitch an idea. She pitched a revolution. She laid out the schematics for a new data syncing architecture, one that utilized machine learning to predict data pathways, making it 50 times faster and infinitely more secure than Omnitech's outdated framework. Daria is running Omnitech on an engine I built a decade ago, Sophia told Victor, sliding a tablet across the table. He's putting a new coat of paint on a dying horse. He doesn't have the technical team to rebuild it from the ground up because they don't understand the foundation. I do. Give me the seed money, give me a team. I will build a product that will make Omnitech obsolete in 3 years. Victor looked at the schematics, his eyes darting across the brilliant code structures. He looked up at Sophia, seeing the raw, unadulterated hunger in her eyes, the eyes of a woman who had been burned alive and had learned to love the fire. I don't invest in revenge, Sophia, Victor said softly. It makes people reckless. It's not revenge, Victor, Sophia replied, her voice turning to ice. It's a market correction. Victor smiled, a slow, predatory grin. I'll give you 10 million, but we do it my way. Total secrecy. A ghost company. Daria Caldwell cannot know you're the one holding the gun until the bullet is already in his chest. Deal. The rebirth of Sophia Bennett was not a loud cinematic montage. It was a brutal, silent grind. With Victor Cross's backing, Sophia established a shell corporation based out of a sleek, unmarked office in Zurich, while she operated from a highly secured bunker-like floor in downtown Chicago. They called the firm Ether Systems. For the next 3 years, Sophia didn't exist to the social world. She didn't date, she didn't attend galas, she barely slept. She poured every ounce of her betrayal, her anger, and her genius into the servers humming around her. She hired the best, most aggressive young developers in the world, kids hungry to disrupt the tech giants. She led them with a relentless, terrifying precision. Gone was the soft-spoken, accommodating wife. In her place stood a formidable CEO wearing sharp black blazers, her hair cut into a severe, sleek bob. Ether Systems developed a product called the Nexus Protocol. It didn't just compete with Omnitech, it humiliated it. While Omnitech was struggling with server crashes and massive data leaks, exactly the bottlenecks Sophia had predicted, the Nexus Protocol was flawless. Instead of going to market loudly, Sophia and Victor played a brilliant game of corporate chess. They didn't sell to the public. They went directly to Omnitech's biggest enterprise clients. Daria Caldwell is arrogant, Victor had told her during one of their late-night strategy sessions. He thinks his market share is a divine right. We don't need to fight him in the press. We just need to quietly turn off the tap. And so they did. It started with the government contracts, then the major healthcare providers. Ether Systems swooped in, offering a product that was faster, cheaper, and profoundly more secure. Because Ether operated through layers of corporate anonymity, Daria had no idea who was poaching his clients. He only knew that his empire was beginning to hemorrhage cash. From her command center in Chicago, Sophia watched the stock price of Omnitech begin its slow, agonizing descent. By the 5th year after the divorce, the trap was fully set. Daria's lavish lifestyle with Vanessa, the private jets, the Hamptons estates, the reckless spending, had drained his personal reserves. To keep Omnitech afloat amidst the mass exodus of clients, he had leveraged everything. He had taken out massive high-interest loans to acquire smaller companies, hoping to buy his way out of a technological deficit he couldn't code his way through. It was a fatal mistake. Daria was drowning in $500 million of corporate debt, and his board of directors, including his father-in-law, Richard Montgomery, were panicking. "They're bleeding out, Sophia," Victor said, his face appearing on the massive monitor in Sophia's office. Daria missed his quarterly earnings by 40%. Montgomery is threatening to oust him as CEO. Sophia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline, a glass of bourbon in her hand. She felt a profound, chilling sense of calm. What's his next move? He's desperate, Victor replied. He's shopping his debt. He needs a private equity firm to buy out his loans and give him a cash injection of at least $100 million to stabilize the company. If he doesn't get it by Friday, Omnitech files for Chapter 11. He'll lose everything. Sophia took a slow sip of her drink. Buy it, Victor paused. All of it? Every single cent of his debt, Sophia commanded. Use Vanguard Holdings, the subsidiary we set up in the Caymans. Pay a premium if you have to. I want to own the paper on his entire life. Over the next 48 hours, an aggressive anonymous private equity firm, Vanguard Holdings, swooped into the financial markets. They bought up Omnitech's debt from the panicked banks, consolidating all of Daria's loans into one massive, unpayable sum. Daria Caldwell was thrilled. In his hubris, he believed he had found a mysterious benefactor, a firm willing to bet on his genius to turn the company around. His lawyers drafted the restructuring agreements, setting up a meeting in New York to finalize the buyout and the cash injection. Daria had stipulated that he wanted to meet the head of Vanguard Holdings face-to-face to shake hands on the deal that would save his legacy. "He wants a meeting," Victor told Sophia over the phone, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. "In the Omnitech boardroom, Tuesday at 10 a.m. Sophia smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Tell him the CEO of Vanguard will be there. Tell him to have the entire board present. I want witnesses." On Tuesday morning, the skies over Manhattan were an iron gray. Sophia stepped out of the back of a black Maybach, adjusting the lapels of her bespoke Tom Ford suit, an ironic nod to the man she was about to bury. She wore her hair pulled tightly back, her makeup flawless and sharp as a blade. She didn't look like the broken woman who had walked out of the city 5 years ago. She looked like a conqueror. She walked into the Omnitech lobby, the same lobby where she had been dismissed, ignored, and betrayed. The security guard didn't recognize her. He merely checked the name Sophia Bennett, CEO Vanguard Holdings, on his manifest and hastily swiped her through to the executive elevators. As she ascended to the top floor, the numbers ticking upward, Sophia felt her pulse steady. There was no anger left, only the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner stepping up to the block. The elevator chimed. She stepped out, walking past the nervous assistants who flanked the hallway. She didn't pause as she approached the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom. Inside, Daria was sweating, making small talk with his father-in-law and the rest of the board, waiting for the billionaire who held his life in their hands. Sophia reached out, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. She pushed the doors open. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a whisper of expensive hinges. The low murmur of the boardroom instantly evaporated. 14 heads turned simultaneously. At the far end of the long, custom-cut glass table sat Richard Montgomery, his face lined with the stress of a collapsing stock portfolio. To his right was Vanessa, dripping in Cartier, playing the role of the devoted corporate wife. And at the head of the table stood Daria Caldwell, mid-sentence, his hand frozen in a gesture of grand explanation. Daria blinked, his slick, practiced smile faltering. He stared at the woman framed in the doorway, his brain struggling to process the visual information. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming subtly on her wrist. The nervous, accommodating girl he had crushed under his heel half a decade ago was gone. In her place stood a woman radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. "Sophia?" Daria's voice was a mixture of confusion and an immediate instinctive irritation. He glanced past her, looking for the security detail. "What the hell are you doing here? This is a closed executive session. You need to leave before I have you escorted out." Sophia didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the imported Italian marble floor in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits entered, carrying thick leather briefcases. They flanked the doors, arms crossed. "I'm afraid security works for the building management, Daria," Sophia said, her voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. "And as of 8 a.m. this morning, Vanguard Holdings purchased the deed to this high-rise, so technically they work for me." A pin drop could have shattered the silence. Vanessa let out a sharp, derisive laugh, breaking the tension. "Are you psychotic? Artie, call the police. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown." "Shut up, Vanessa," Richard Montgomery snapped, his shrewd eyes darting from the bodyguards to the undeniable confidence radiating from his ex-daughter-in-law. He had survived Wall Street for 40 years. He knew the smell of blood in the water. He turned his gaze to Sophia. "Miss Bennett, you mentioned Vanguard Holdings." Sophia walked to the empty leather chair directly opposite Daria. She didn't sit. She placed both hands flat on the glass table, leaning in slightly. "I am the Chief Executive Officer and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings," Sophia announced, the words ringing out like a judge reading a sentence. Yesterday afternoon, my firm finalized the acquisition of Omnitech's entire corporate debt structure from your primary lenders. $482 million in principal, plus accrued interest and penalties. Daria's face drained of color. The arrogant flush vanished, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. That's impossible. Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. You don't have that kind of capital. You live in Queens. I lived in Queens 5 years ago, Daria, Sophia corrected softly, when you handed me a $50,000 check and told me I was nothing. Since then, I've relocated, and I've been busy. She snapped her fingers. One of the men at the door stepped forward, unzipping his briefcase. He placed a thick stack of legally bound documents directly onto the glass table, sliding them down the slick surface until they hit Daria's hands. Those are the promissory notes, Sophia said. Every single loan you took out to cover your failing acquisitions, every line of credit you over-leveraged to keep your stock price artificially inflated. I own it all, and because you missed 2 consecutive covenant benchmarks last quarter, I'm executing the acceleration clause. Daria stared at the documents, his hands beginning to tremble. He recognized the signatures, the bank seals. It was real. Acceleration clause? He whispered, the reality crashing down on him. It means, Richard Montgomery growled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he glared at Daria, that the entire sum of the debt is due immediately, today. $512 million to be exact, Sophia clarified, finally pulling out the leather chair and sitting down, crossing her legs with agonizing grace. Payable by the close of business at 5 p.m. Or I force Omnitech into immediate liquidation, strip the assets, and personally sue the board for gross fiduciary negligence. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Several board members began shouting at once. Vanessa stood up, her face twisted in fury, screaming at Daria to do something. Daria just stood there, paralyzed, staring at the woman he had thrown away like garbage. Let's not do the hysterics, Sophia said, echoing the exact phrase Daria had used the day she caught him cheating. The callback hit Daria like a physical blow. He stumbled back, gripping the back of his chair for support. You can't do this, Daria choked out, the charm completely stripped from his voice, leaving only a pathetic whine. You're trying to destroy my company out of petty jealousy. Sophia tilted her head, a cold smile touching the corners of her lips. Your company? Daria, Omnitech has been dead for 2 years. You just didn't notice the smell. You've lost 60% of your enterprise clients. Your government contracts were severed. Have you ever wondered why? Daria froze. A new, sickening dread began to pool in his stomach. You, Daria stammered. Ether Systems, Sophia stated. The firm that took the Department of Defense contract from you. The firm that poached your top 3 healthcare providers. That's my company, Daria. I built the Nexus protocol. I engineered the software that made your stolen code entirely obsolete. Vanessa gasped, sinking back into her chair. Richard Montgomery covered his face with his hands, groaning audibly. The board members fell dead silent, the sheer magnitude of the long con washing over them. Sophia hadn't just bought his debt, she was the architect of his financial ruin. She had starved him out, watched him borrow money to survive, and then bought the noose he tied around his own neck. You stole my intellectual property, Daria suddenly screamed, pointing a trembling finger at her. Ether Systems is built on Omnitech code. I'll sue you. I'll take every cent you have. Sophia didn't flinch at Daria's outburst. She reached into her suit pocket and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of paper. She laid it flat on the table and slid it toward him. I brought a copy of our divorce settlement, Sophia said, her tone almost conversational. Specifically, page 42. Your lawyer, Simon Davies, drafted it very carefully. It states that I, Sophia Bennett, explicitly surrender any and all claims to the intellectual property of Omnitech, recognizing that the code is solely your creation and that my contributions were negligible and without market value. Daria stared at the paper, his chest heaving. Furthermore, Sophia continued, her voice hardening into steel, it includes a blanket waiver stating I have no right to any assets or IP generated during the marriage. You legally established in a court of law that my brain was not an asset to your company. Therefore, anything I built after the divorce is entirely mine. You built a legal fortress to keep me out of Omnitech, Daria. You just forgot to make sure I couldn't build a better castle next door. Simon! Daria yelled, spinning around to look at his corporate counsel who was shrinking into the corner of the room. Is she right? Tell me she's bluffing." Simon Davies, the bulldog lawyer who had relentlessly bullied Sophia 5 years ago, looked at the document, then at the massive stack of debt notes. He swallowed hard, visibly sweating. "Daria, she owns the debt, and the IP waiver is ironclad. You insisted on it to prevent her from asking for royalties later. Fix it." Daria roared, slamming his fists on the table, the glass rattling. "There's nothing to fix." Richard Montgomery's voice cut through the room like a whip. The billionaire investor stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Daria not with anger, but with absolute disgust. "You arrogant, incompetent fool. You told me the client bleed was a temporary market fluctuation. You told me you had the tech to beat ether systems. You didn't even know who was beating you." "Richard, please," Daria begged, his voice cracking. "We can fight this. We can tie them up in litigation. You have the capital." "I am not throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into a burning building to save your ego," Richard snarled. He turned to Sophia, his demeanor shifting instantly from fury to cold, calculated business. "Miss Bennett, you didn't come here just to bankrupt him. If you force liquidation, you get pennies on the dollar for the debt. You want something else." Sophia nodded slightly, respecting the old man's sharp instincts. "I want Omnitech, all of it. The brand, the remaining patents, the infrastructure. I want to absorb it into ether systems." "Impossible," Daria spat. "I own 51% of the voting shares." "For now," Sophia replied. She looked at Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, you and the board control the remaining 49%. If you sign your voting rights over to Vanguard Holdings today, I will restructure the debt. I will absorb the losses, and I will ensure that the board members are bought out at 20 cents on the dollar. It's a massive loss, but it prevents personal bankruptcy and SEC investigations into how you let this man drive your investments into a mountain." Richard's eyes narrowed as he did the mental math. 20 cents on the dollar was brutal. It meant losing tens of millions, but fighting Sophia meant losing it all, plus the public humiliation of a highly publicized bankruptcy trial. "Dad, no!" Vanessa shrieked, jumping up. "If you give her your shares, Daria loses control. We lose everything. The penthouse, the cars." Richard looked at his daughter, his expression devoid of pity. "You should have married a smarter man, Vanessa." He looked back at Sophia. "If I give you my proxy, what happens to him?" He pointed a thumb at Daria. "If the board surrenders their shares," Sophia outlined, her eyes locking onto Daria's terrified face, "I will offer Daria a deal. He signs over his 51%, transferring complete ownership of Omnitech to me. In exchange, I will not force the company into bankruptcy, which means the corporate veil remains intact." "And if I don't sign?" Daria whispered, realizing he was entirely outmaneuvered. "If you don't sign," Sophia said, leaning forward, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 10 degrees, "I call the debt. Omnitech files for Chapter 7 by noon. The courts will pierce the corporate veil because of your reckless mismanagement. The creditors will seize your penthouse, your offshore accounts, your wife's jewelry, and every single thing you bought with the money you stole from my labor. You will walk out of this building with the clothes on your back, exactly like I did." Daria looked frantically around the table. The board members, men he had wined and dined, men who had clapped him on the back and called him a visionary, were already reaching for their customized gold pens. They were signing their proxies over to Richard. They were abandoning ship. "Vanessa," Daria pleaded, reaching for his wife's hand. Vanessa recoiled, snatching her hand away as if he were diseased. The illusion of their glamorous, powerful partnership shattered in an instant. She looked at him with a mixture of panic and revulsion. "You're broke," she breathed, the reality sinking in. "You're completely broke." She turned to her father. "Dad, we have prenups, right? He can't touch my trust fund?" "Your trust fund is secure, Vanessa," Richard said flatly. He took the bundle of proxies from the board members, walked over to Sophia, and laid them gently in front of her. 49% of Omnitech voting shares, Miss Bennett. The board is yours." Sophia didn't even look at the papers. Her eyes were fixed on Daria. The man who had taken her youth, her genius, and her dignity was now standing completely alone in the ruins of the empire she had allowed him to build. "Well, Daria," Sophia said, sliding a single terrifyingly simple contract across the glass table toward him. "It seems we are at a crossroads. Sign the company over to me, or I take everything else." Daria looked at the contract. The line for his signature seemed to mock him. He thought of the penthouse, the private flights, The identity he had constructed as a tech god. It was all a facade, and the architect had just arrived with a wrecking ball. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. The gold-plated Mont Blanc pen felt as heavy as an anvil in Daria's trembling fingers. He looked down at the contract, a single page of sterile, unfeeling legal jargon that represented the total annihilation of his life's work. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of his own breathing. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, searching the room for a lifeline. He looked at Simon Davies, his aggressively expensive attorney who was actively avoiding eye contact, packing his leather briefcase with a coward's haste. He looked at Richard Montgomery, the billionaire father-in-law who had just sold him out to protect his own portfolio. Finally, his gaze landed on Vanessa. She was already texting on her phone, her face a mask of cold calculation. She wasn't calling for help, she was calling her divorce attorney. The prenuptial agreement they had signed protected her family's wealth, but it also meant she was tied to none of his liabilities. She was severing the rotting limb before the infection could spread. "Do it, Daria." Sophia's voice cut through the stagnant air. It wasn't a shout, it was a command delivered with the quiet, terrifying authority of an apex predator. "Every second you hesitate, the interest compounds. It's 10:42 a.m. At noon, my legal team files the Chapter 7 paperwork with the Federal Bankruptcy Court in the Southern District of New York. The marshals will be at your penthouse by 1 p.m. Daria swallowed a dry sob. He pressed the nib of the pen to the heavy cardstock. His signature, usually a sweeping, arrogant flourish that he loved to plaster on press releases and tech magazines, was reduced to a jagged, pathetic scrawl. He pushed the paper back across the glass table. Sophia didn't snatch it. She didn't gloat. She simply placed a manicured finger on the document and slid it into her portfolio. "Thank you, Daria. A smart decision. Perhaps your first one in 5 years." Suddenly, a dark, desperate spark ignited in Daria's eyes, a final flailing attempt at survival. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the marble floor. "You think you've won," he spat, his voice trembling with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and despair. "You get the shell of Omnitech, but you don't get the proprietary client data. You don't get the offshore backups. I still have the encryption keys to the Cayman servers. I can wipe the entire database right now. I can burn the remaining infrastructure to the ground before your IT team even figures out the passwords." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb frantically unlocking the screen to access the master override application he had built for emergencies. If he couldn't have his empire, nobody would. He would scorch the earth and sell the decrypted raw data on the dark web. It was a felony, but it was a golden parachute. Sophia didn't move to stop him. She just watched him, an expression of profound pity crossing her face for the very first time. "Go ahead," she said softly. Daria's thumb hovered over the red execute icon on his screen. He pressed it. The screen flashed. Then a bold black prompt appeared. "Access denied, credentials revoked by system administrator." Daria froze. He tapped the icon again and again. "Access denied." "Did you really think," Sophia said, standing up and smoothing the front of her suit, "that I would let you hold a match anywhere near my property? I told you, Daria, Omnitech runs on my architecture. Even the upgrades your mediocre developers patched together over the last 5 years were built on top of my foundational code." She walked slowly around the table, stopping a few feet from where Daria stood paralyzed. 4 years ago, Sophia continued, her voice echoing in the cavernous room, when I was building ether systems, I found a backdoor in Omnitech's legacy code, a dormant subroutine I had written in Brooklyn to help debug the servers. You never found it because you never bothered to read the code that made you rich. At 8:01 a.m. today, 1 minute after Vanguard Holdings took possession of the building, my lead engineer executed a script through that back door. Your access to the mainframe, the offshore servers, your corporate email, and even your digital parking pass was completely revoked. Daria dropped his phone. It clattered against the marble floor, the screen cracking. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just been outplayed today, he had been a puppet dancing on her strings for years. "It's over, Daria," Richard Montgomery said gruffly, standing up and adjusting his tie. "Have some damn dignity and walk out." He turned to Sophia, offering a stiff, respectful nod. "Miss Bennett, a ruthless acquisition. I look forward to reading about ether systems in the Wall Street Journal." Richard turned and walked toward the doors. "Vanessa, wait," Daria pleaded as his wife stood to follow her father. Vanessa paused, looking him up and down as if he were a stranger who had just bumped into her on the subway. "My lawyer will send yours the papers by the end of the week, Daria. Don't call me. The penthouse is under my father's LLC, so I suggest you pack your things by tonight." She walked out without looking back, the scent of her expensive perfume fading into the sterile air of the boardroom. Sophia pressed a button on her smartwatch. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy mahogany doors opened again. This time, it wasn't board members. It was 3 large, unsmiling men wearing the tactical uniforms of Aegis Security, the elite private firm Sophia had contracted for the transition. "Mr. Caldwell is no longer an employee of this company," Sophia informed the lead guard. "Please escort him off the premises. He is not permitted to return to his office. His personal effects will be boxed and mailed to a forwarding address." "Wait, I need my laptop, my car keys," Daria protested, panic rising in his throat as 2 of the guards stepped up to flank him. "Your corporate laptop is company property," Sophia replied. "And since the company leased your Mercedes Maybach, those keys belong to me now too. You can keep the suit." The guards each placed a firm, immovable hand on Daria's shoulders. As they turned him toward the door, Daria looked back at Sophia one last time. He wanted to see hatred. He wanted to see a vengeful, gloating ex-wife. It would have made the pill easier to swallow, validating his ego that he was still the center of her universe, even in her hatred. But Sophia wasn't looking at him with hatred. She was already looking down at her tablet, swiping through a spreadsheet, dismissing him entirely from her reality. He was no longer a person to her. He was a completed item on a 5-year-old to-do list. Daria Caldwell, former tech visionary and multimillionaire, was marched out of the executive suite, down the glass elevators, and through the crowded lobby of the building he used to own. Whispers erupted among the staff as they watched their arrogant CEO being frog-marched by security. They pushed him through the revolving doors and out onto the cold, unforgiving pavement of Fifth Avenue. He stood there on the sidewalk, shivering in his Tom Ford suit as the New York wind ripped through him. He had no phone, no car, no company, and no wife. He dug into his pockets. All he found was a $20 bill and a Metro card. Daria looked up at the towering glass skyscraper of Omnitech. At the very top, in the window of the executive boardroom, he thought he saw a figure looking down at him. But it was impossible to tell. The glass was tinted, designed to keep the world out and keep the power in. 8 months later, the iconic skyline of Manhattan had surrendered to a new architectural sovereign. The colossal, ostentatious neon Omnitech sign that had once dominated the top of the glass tower, a monument to Daria Caldwell's boundless ego, had been systematically dismantled piece by piece. In its place, glowing with a quiet, icy blue sophistication, was the sleek, minimalist crest of Ether Systems. The physical transition of the building was a perfect reflection of the corporate bloodletting that had occurred inside it. The toxic frat house culture Daria had cultivated, fueled by expensive scotch and empty promises, was meticulously eradicated. Sophia had fired the bloated middle management tier within her first week. She replaced them with sharp, hungry, and brilliant minds who cared more about quantum computing algorithms than luxury golf retreats. The lobby no longer smelled of Daria's cloying designer cologne. It smelled of dark roast espresso and the ozone hum of bleeding-edge technology. The business world was entirely captivated by the bloodless coup. The Wall Street Journal had run a breathtaking multi-page spread titled "The Ghost Who Bought the Machine." Forbes had put Sophia on the cover, her piercing gaze daring anyone to underestimate her again. She was heralded not just as a ruthless visionary, but as the architect of the most flawless, surgically precise, hostile takeover in modern Wall Street history. Inside the penthouse office that used to belong to her ex-husband, Sophia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling yellow taxis of Fifth Avenue. The room had been entirely gutted. The gaudy pop art and suffocating leather sofas Daria adored were gone. In their place was a stark, ultra-modern command center, dominated by a massive, curved holographic display projecting real-time global data syncing across Ether's newly absorbed server networks. The heavy mahogany doors parted, and Victor Cross strode into the room. The legendary venture capitalist looked entirely in his element, holding a sleek silver tablet and wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than Daria's current annual salary. You skipped the Montgomery Charity Gala last night, Sophia, Victor noted, sinking comfortably into a low-profile lounge chair. A predatory smirk played on his lips. It was quite the scene. Richard Montgomery spent an hour trying to corner me near the ice sculpture, practically begging for an early investment window into our Series C funding round. Sophia turned away from the window, a genuine, relaxed smile reaching her eyes. She walked over to her sprawling glass desk. Let him beg, Victor. We don't need his capital anymore. With Omnitech's infrastructure fully absorbed and optimized by the Nexus protocol, Ether Systems is cash flow positive. Our market cap just broke $7 billion this morning. True enough, Victor conceded, lacing his fingers together. It's a breathtaking view from the top of the mountain. Speaking of the bottom of the barrel, did you hear the final rulings from the SEC? Sophia sat down, adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate white silk blouse. I heard they concluded their investigation into Daria's financial engineering. I haven't read the brief yet. Concluded is a polite, sanitized word for it. Victor chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming with schadenfreude. They completely eviscerated him. The forensic accountants found the hidden off-balance sheet loans, the forged quarterly projections, and his pathetic attempts to artificially inflate Omnitech's stock price while he was secretly bleeding enterprise clients. They hit him with a lifetime ban. Daria Caldwell can never serve as an officer, director, or even a consultant for a public company ever again. He's completely radioactive. He couldn't get a job sweeping floors in Silicon Valley. And what about the criminal charges? Sophia asked, her tone entirely neutral. It wasn't gloating, it was the clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a completed experiment. He avoided federal prison by a hair, Victor explained. He turned state's witness and rolled on 3 of his own board members who were complicit in the wire fraud. It kept him out of a cell, but it made him a pariah. He has 0 friends left. Even his country club revoked his membership. And Vanessa? Sophia asked, leaning back in her chair. Victor let out a sharp laugh. That might be the best twist of all. Vanessa's ironclad prenup protected her trust fund from Daria's implosion, but she forgot one crucial detail. Her father controls the trust. Richard was so humiliated by the public scandal and so furious at losing $50 million in the Omnitech collapse that he placed her finances under a strict conservatorship. He cut off her black cards. She's currently living in a generic 2-bedroom condo in Boca Raton on a heavily monitored allowance, driving a leased Honda. Her lifestyle brand collapsed overnight when she couldn't afford to pay her Instagram followers anymore. Sophia felt a brief, hollow pang of amusement, but it faded quickly. The destruction of the people who had wronged her was thorough and absolute, yet it didn't provide the fiery rush of euphoria she had once imagined during those freezing, miserable nights in her Queens apartment. There's one more thing, Victor said, his tone shifting to something slightly more serious. He slid a printed piece of paper across the glass desk. This bypassed the corporate spam filters this morning. Your assistant brought it to me. I thought you should see it before we shred it. Sophia picked up the paper. It was an email sent from a generic free webmail account. Sophia, I know I have no right to contact you. I lost everything. I'm currently working as a shift supervisor at a regional logistics warehouse in Newark. I take the commuter bus 2 hours each way. I can barely make rent. I know I made mistakes, but we used to be a team. We built the foundation together. I know the Omnitech legacy systems better than anyone. I'm begging you, Sophia. I need a job, even a low-level consulting gig. Please. I have nowhere else to go. Daria Sophia stared at the words. 5 years ago, the thought of Daria ruined, desperate, and begging for scraps from her table would have been her ultimate fantasy. It was the burning fuel that had kept her awake through thousands of hours of coding. It was the rage that had birthed the Nexus protocol. But as she read the pathetic, groveling words of the man who had once discarded her like garbage, she realized something profound. She felt absolutely nothing. The anger had burned itself out long ago, leaving behind something infinitely more valuable. Unshakable power and total, uncompromising peace. Daria Caldwell was no longer the villain of her story. He was just a small, insignificant footnote in the history of Ether Systems. Draft a response, Victor asked, watching her face closely. No, Sophia said softly, dropping the paper into the sleek metal recycling bin beside her desk. Silence is the only answer he deserves. But I do want you to do one thing for him. Victor raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. "Send him a severance package," Sophia commanded, her voice steady and clear. "Cut a cashier's check from the corporate account for exactly $50,000. Tell the legal department to draft the settlement agreement exactly the way his lawyer, Simon Davies, drafted my divorce papers. I want the exact same font, the exact same condescending boilerplate language, and leave the memo line entirely blank." Victor stared at her for a moment before a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. Poetic symmetry. A beautiful, brutal closing of the loop. "I'll have the lawyers draft it and courier it to his warehouse in Newark this afternoon." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "You built a hell of a company, Sophia. I'm incredibly proud to be your partner." "Thank you, Victor, for betting on the ghost." As Victor exited the office, the heavy doors sealing shut behind him, Sophia stood alone at the absolute apex of the corporate world. She placed her hand against the cool glass of the window, looking down at the thousands of people moving through the city below. She had been one of them once, broken, betrayed, and stripped of her dignity. She walked slowly back to her desk, ignoring the massive holographic arrays and the complex billion-dollar financial projections floating on her monitors. She reached into the locked bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a battered, scratched 10-year-old laptop. It was entirely obsolete, a sluggish dinosaur compared to the quantum-level servers humming in the floors below her. She opened the lid, running her manicured fingers over the faded, worn-out keys. This was where it had all started, not with anger, and not with a consuming desire for revenge. It had started with a quiet, unrelenting belief in her own mind. The world had tried to tell her that her genius belonged to a man. The world had tried to convince her that she was a mere supporting character in someone else's grand narrative. She had almost let them believe it, right up until the moment she decided to rewrite the source code of her own life. Sophia Bennett closed the laptop, the soft click echoing satisfyingly in the quiet, sunlit office. She sat down in her leather chair, opened the Ether System's master dashboard, and went back to work. Betrayal is often viewed as an ending, a devastating conclusion to trust, love, and partnership. For Sophia Bennett, it was the necessary destruction of an illusion that had been holding her back. The tragedy of Daria Caldwell was not that he lost his company, but that he never truly understood what built it. He believed power resided in the loud, performative arrogance of the boardroom, failing to see that true, unshakable power is forged in silence, resilience, and undeniable competence. Sophia's return wasn't just a masterclass in corporate vengeance. It was a profound reclamation of self-worth. By stripping away the noise, the emotional chaos, and the fear, she weaponized her own erasure to build an empire. Ultimately, her greatest victory was not seeing her ex-husband's downfall, but realizing that his existence no longer mattered. She had outgrown the need for his defeat, finding absolute peace in her own spectacular ascent.